sold Oriental carpet at John Wanamaker Department Store in Center City, Philadelphia for 44 years. So from the time I was a little tot on through my young adulthood, I would get on the train, either the Pennsylvania or Reading line. Of course, at first with my mother, and then later myself, just alone. And I would go downtown, Philadelphia, and you'd merge through the labyrinth of the train stations, and you'd come up on the street level, and there you were, in the center of a busy, bustling metropolitan city. You could see City Hall, you could see Gimbels and Wanamakers and Litt Brothers and all the stores that were around at that time, from the 50s through the 60s, no longer are. And of course, in those days, all kinds of things happened on the street. It wasn't quite like today. We had all kinds of panhandlers, all kinds of folks doing all sorts of things on the street. And we had our variety, our fair share of street preachers, either on an old wooden crate, where they would stand at the corner, or wear maybe one of those placards back in front, the end is coming. And when I was little, I would listen to them. And they would speak of the horrors of hell in the most vivid terms. When I was just a lad, I was quite mesmerized by this. And then as I grew up and as I went to seminary at Eastern Baptist Theological Seminary and became a little bit more acquainted with all the ins and outs of the gospel, I listened to them with a different ear, a different sensitivity. And what they were saying was absolutely right, but it wasn't compelling to me. It wasn't appealing to me. Back in the 1700s, we had our first great awakening, our first great evangelical revival in the United States from the 1730s to the 1750s. And Jonathan Edwards was at the forefront of that. He preached a very powerful sermon, and it was all about the horrors of hell. And hell is very real, and people need to hear that message. I know that. But I want to just quote a little quote from Jonathan Edwards' sermon, okay? The sermon is entitled, "Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God." He said, and I quote, "There is no want of power in God to cast wicked men into hell at any moment. Men's hands cannot be strong. When God raises up, the strongest have no power to resist him, nor can any deliver out of his hands. He is only able to cast wicked men into hell. He's not only able to cast wicked men into hell, but he can most easily do it. Sometimes an earthly prince meets with a great deal of difficulty in subduing a rebel who has found means to fortify himself and has made himself strong by the number of his followers. But it is not so with God. There is no fortress that is any defense from the power of God. Though hand join hand in a vast multitude themselves, they are easily broken into pieces. They are as great heaps of light chaff before the whirlwind, or large quantities of dry stubble before the devouring flames. We find it easy to tread on and crush a worm that we see crawling on the earth. So it is for us to cut or single a slender thread that anything hangs by. Thus easy it is for God, when he pleases, to cast his enemies down to hell. It is reported that after the sermon, which went on for about an hour and a half, I might add, just a side note, grown men were weeping in the pews. Women were wailing. Children were probably doodling. But nevertheless, it had a tremendous impact and began what was known as the Great Awakening. Now, it seems that the way we present the gospel matters a great deal. Think about the ways you try to share the gospel and the good news about your faith. Are we making friends, family, or co-workers feel safe and cared about as we tell them why we believe what we believe? Or might they feel confused or judged or even perhaps a little afraid of us? There are so many misconceptions about Christianity out there today. How can we avoid and preclude some of these in order to share the good news about Jesus? What can we do to get people to listen? Paul, the apostle, gives us an example. He had just narrowly escaped in the passage that was read to you today. He had just narrowly escaped being beaten to death. He must have been badly bruised and shaken. He had recovered his composure enough to ask permission to speak to the crowd. They thought that he had taken a person who was not a Jewish believer into the wrong place at the temple, where non-Jews were not allowed, where Gentiles were not allowed, and so he was in big trouble. And he recovered his composure enough to ask permission to speak to the crowd. So Claudius Lysias, an honest, open-minded Roman soldier who compared favorably against the crowd, had assumed without troubling to check that Paul had brought the Gentile, whose name was Trophimus, into the inner court. Lysias had mistakenly assumed Paul was an Egyptian terrorist, but he changed his mind when he learned the facts. And let's look at how Paul goes out of his way to show them the way. And that's way with a capital W, because the early believers were known as followers of the way. Paul identifies with their story. He speaks their language. He meets them where they are. The commander expressed surprise at Paul's ability to speak Greek. Now, that was Koine Greek, was the trade language of the empire. It was the language that everybody used to communicate, and then they had their own language. But it was the language of commerce and culture. But then, when Paul addressed this crowd, he changes his language from Greek to Aramaic, their native tongue. And he speaks to the crowd in their vernacular. The fact that Paul spoke fluent Aramaic caused the people to become very quiet. Any who may have thought this was a collaborator with the Gentiles would probably have realized they were wrong. You see, Paul respected their heritage. To the angry crowd in Jerusalem, whose complaint was that he taught against the law, the temple, and the people, Paul stressed his personal loyalty to his Jewish origins and his faith. Paul begins respectively calling his audience brothers and fathers. He spoke of his Jewish birth and upbringing and of his training in the law of our ancestors under the eminent teacher Gamaliel. Paul's Jewishness was undisputable. He was a Hebrew of Hebrews, and with a thorough training as a Pharisee under the most revered teacher of the day. Paul understands how they think. He draws attention to his zeal for God, which was as great as theirs, since he had persecuted followers of the way of the church, even to prison and death. The Sanhedrin could attest to this, since it was they who had issued him with the extradition orders that he took with him to Damascus. And the description of his activity as the persecutor of Christians opened the way for him to describe his conversion. When we have nothing else to share, we always have our own testimony, don't we? The difference that Jesus has made in our own lives. This is not a canned stump speech that Paul gives everywhere. He is very mindful of whom he's addressing and tailors his message accordingly. He identifies with their story. You know that according to the research from the Center for the Study of Global Christianity, and this is amazing to me, just amazing, 1 out of 5 non-Christians in North America does not personally know a single follower of Christ. That's over 13 million people who don't have a Christian friend or even a Christian acquaintance. The percentages get even higher for certain other religious groups. For instance, 65% of Buddhists, 75% of Chinese people, 78% of Hindus, 43% of Muslims in America do not personally know a follower of Jesus Christ.